The boots were wrapped in old scrubs at the bottom of her locker, hidden beneath 3 pairs of white Dansko clogs that had never been broken in. Katie Rodriguez hadn't unpacked them on her first day at Oak Creek Memorial. Hadn't unpacked much of anything. The cardboard box that had arrived at her apartment in Raleigh sat open on the small desk in her room, its contents arranged with the same precision she used to organize surgical instruments: 1 navy coffee mug with a hairline crack running through the anchor insignia, 1 dying succulent in a ceramic pot, 1 photograph she kept turning face down, and nothing else that mattered. No certificates. No commendations. No proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez had ever existed anywhere except in the classified files of the Naval Special Warfare Command and the memories of people who were no longer allowed to speak her name. The official record said she was a civilian. A nurse from Tampa who'd gotten her RN license 3 years ago and moved to North Carolina for a fresh start. The background check cleared within 48 hours because every database that might have contradicted that story had been scrubbed clean. Operation Sandpiper. The extraction that went sideways in Helmand Province. The incident that the Pentagon had spent 6 months erasing from existence. Everyone connected to it had been quietly retired, reassigned, or, in the case of Marcus Webb's gunner's mate, declared dead in a manner that left no loose threads. Katie kept her head down the way she'd been trained to keep her head down when the pressure was descending on you at depth and the only way out was forward, slow, measured breaths, no panic, no noise. She arrived at Oak Creek Memorial on a Monday in September, before the day shift had fully assembled, when the parking lot was still mostly empty and the early morning light made the concrete look like the color of old bone. The hospital sprawled across for city blocks in downtown Raleigh, all glass and brushed steel, a monument to modern medicine and the careful balance of insurance claims and pharmaceutical partnerships. She wore scrubs that were generic blue, not navy, and her hair was pulled back tight enough that it seemed to pull her features into something neutral and unremarkable. The limp in her left leg, the one that came from shrapnel that had exited before it reached the femoral artery by a distance that was measured in millimeters, she disguised by walking with her weight distributed evenly, deliberately slow. No one noticed limps when you didn't draw attention to them. No one noticed anything about you when you were careful not to be seen. The surgical supply room on the 3rd floor became her geography during that first week. 3 days into her tenure, she had reorganized every cabinet, inventory-coded every instrument, and flagged 3 outdated medications that should have been removed from rotation months ago. Her hands moved with the kind of economy of motion that came from working in confined spaces, the kind of spaces where one wasted gesture could mean the difference between a successful operation and a body bag. A navy coffee mug with a hairline crack wasn't subtle, but it was subtle enough. She kept it on the supply cart during morning rounds, wrapped it carefully each evening, placed it in her locker beside the photograph she wouldn't look at. The gunner's mate's name had been Rodriguez too. No relation to anyone. A coincidence she was allowed to keep as a private thing. Dr. Hargrove saw her on the 2nd day, when she was checking medication dosages for the 3rd time, a habit born from the kind of precision that kept people alive in places where ambulances didn't exist. He appeared in the doorway of the supply room with the particular silence of a man accustomed to not being heard approaching, and she became aware of him the way she became aware of most things, first as an absence of normal sound, then as the particular weight of another person's regard. He was 48, maybe 50, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses rather than sun exposure, and his movements had the slack confidence of a man who'd never been held accountable for anything in his life. His shoes cost more than Katie's entire wardrobe. "First week going well?" he asked, and she heard the question the way she heard most of the spoken words in this place, as a surface-level inquiry beneath which other conversations were happening in frequencies she was trained to detect. "Yes, Doctor," Katie said, maintaining eye contact for exactly 2 seconds before looking back at the vials in her hands. "Standard procedures. No issues." He watched her recheck the medication label against the computer screen, watched her verify the dosage, watched her arrange the vial in its designated slot in the cabinet. He didn't move. He just stood there the way a predator stands, present, observing, cataloging information. She could smell his cologne. Something expensive and aggressive. Something that made the air in the small room feel suddenly too thick to breathe. "You're very precise," Dr. Hargrove said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. An assessment. Most nurses work faster. Less careful. Speed isn't compatible with accuracy in this environment, Katie replied, and the moment the words left her mouth, she understood her mistake. She'd said too much. She'd revealed the thinking underneath the action, and that revealed too much about where that thinking had come from. She adjusted her tone downward, softer, more deferential. I apologize. I'm still learning the hospital's procedures. But he was already moving, already turning away, already cataloguing whatever he thought he needed to know about the quiet new nurse who moved like she'd been trained to move and spoke like she'd been trained to speak. She heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway, heard the creak of his office door opening on the far side of the surgical wing. She didn't exhale until she was certain he was gone. That afternoon, she watched him in the hallway outside the break room, talking with a pharmaceutical representative whose name tag read Ashford Pharmaceuticals. The rep was handing Hargrove an envelope, nothing hidden about it, just slipping it into the inside pocket of his white coat the way you'd hand someone a menu at a restaurant. Their voices were low, but not low enough that she couldn't hear the essential information: new cardiac medication, 30% markup on the hospital formulary, kickback arrangement for any doctor who exceeded prescription quotas. The representative laughed, a sound like someone had just told an excellent joke. Hargrove smiled the smile of a man who understood perfectly how the machinery worked and had no intention of questioning it. Katie turned away. Moved into the break room. Poured coffee from the pot that had been sitting there since 6 a.m. and was now the consistency of tar. She sat in the plastic chair in the corner, the one that no one else ever chose, and drank the coffee without tasting it. This was not her hospital. This was not her fight. She was a ghost here, a placeholder, a person who'd been erased from every official record and was only a person at all because paperwork required names. The Navy coffee mug sat on the counter, abandoned. She didn't retrieve it. The break room door opened and 3 junior residents came in, all of them younger than 30, all of them moving with the brittle energy of people who hadn't yet learned how to carry exhaustion as a permanent condition. They were talking about Hargrove, about a case he'd reassigned away from one of them because the resident had questioned the surgical approach. The resident's name was Chen. He'd been at Oak Creek for 14 months and was apparently developing the habit of thinking for himself, which seemed to be a liability. He told me the case was too complex for my current skill level, Chen said. He was clearly trying to make it sound like something other than what it was. Probably good feedback. Learning opportunity. One of the other residents, a woman named Soto, made a sound that wasn't quite skeptical but had skepticism buried in it. He reassigned it because you questioned the markup on the artificial valve he was ordering. The one that's 30% more expensive than the alternative, with no clinical difference. We don't know that, Chen said, but he didn't sound convinced. We know that, Soto replied. I looked it up. Same outcomes, same durability, same infection rates. Half the cost if Hargrove didn't have arrangements with the supplier. Katie listened without appearing to listen. This was a skill that had been trained into her over 16 years of field work, the ability to hear everything while seeming to hear nothing. The information settled into the part of her mind that was always organizing patterns, always recognizing threat structures. This hospital had a corruption architecture. It ran on money and pressure and the kind of power that came from knowing things about people. Dr. Hargrove was positioned at the center of that architecture, and he was comfortable there. That evening, a man was wheeled into the emergency department, and Katie heard about it from the OR nurse who'd been paging for surgical coverage since 5 p.m. His name was Marcus Webb. Army Ranger, triple amputee, admitted with acute abdominal pain and a history that seemed to follow him the way shadows follow things at sunset. 7 different surgeons had already refused to take his case this week. 7 doctors who'd looked at his chart, seen the disabilities and the complications and the pre-existing conditions, and decided that his status as a disabled veteran was somehow incompatible with receiving emergency treatment. The case was now sitting on Hargrove's desk, and she heard him talking about it in the hallway outside his office, heard the particular weight he placed on the words liability and complicated and resource allocation. She heard him telling the attending physician that they should probably transfer Webb to a facility in Chapel Hill, that Oak Creek wasn't equipped for that level of complexity. She heard the attending physician accepting this without question, the way people accepted things from people with authority and golf tans and pharmaceutical envelopes in their coat pockets. Katie stood in the supply room and held a surgical tray in her hands and understood with the kind of clarity that only comes from watching systems work that no one in this building was going to help Marcus Webb. They'd built a structure of refusal so elegant that it would collapse inward of its own weight, and a disabled man would be lost in the collapse the way people were always lost in collapses. She set the tray down carefully, with deliberation, with the kind of precision that no one would recognize as anything other than routine work. But underneath that precision was something else, the kind of attention you learn to pay to things when the consequences of being wrong could be measured in lives. And underneath that was something older still, something that had been sleeping since the moment the Pentagon decided that Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez no longer officially existed. Something that didn't accept impossible situations. Something that never, in any circumstance, ever left people behind. Katie's first week at Oak Creek Memorial had taught her one fundamental truth: keep your head down, do your work, and never let them see what you actually are. That was the protocol that had kept her alive in Helmand Province. That was the protocol that would keep her alive here. On her third day, the betting pool had already started. She'd heard the residents laughing about it in the break room while she restocked the supply cart, $50 each on her quit date, their guesses written on the whiteboard in blue marker like a countdown to her failure. One had written Friday. Another, more optimistic, 2 weeks, tops. Dr. Hargrove had walked past her station that morning and said loud enough for the surgical team to hear, "Rodriguez, right? Let's see how long this one lasts." The way he'd said it, voice like gravel scraping concrete, made it clear this wasn't curiosity. It was a threat dressed in casual cruelty. She'd assigned herself to bedpan duty while the other nurses handled post-ops. When she'd questioned an antibiotic dosage during rounds, Hargrove had corrected her in front of 3 residents, "You're here to follow orders, not think." The words had landed like a blade, clean and precise. Katie had nodded once, just once, and walked away without defending herself, without flinching, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her react. That was the old training. That was the discipline that had kept her unit alive. But discipline had its limit. The cafeteria at noon was crowded with staff rotating through lunch. Katie carried her tray, turkey sandwich, apple, coffee, salad, past the table where Hargrove sat surrounded by his residents like a general holding court. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the doorway ahead, calculating the shortest path back to the surgical wing. She didn't see his foot extend until her ankle caught it and the physics took over, weight shifting, balance collapsing, gravity accelerating downward at 32 feet per second squared. The tray hit the floor first. The crash echoed across the entire cafeteria like a gunshot in a hollow room. Soup spread across the tile in a dark comma. The salad scattered like confetti. Her coffee mug shattered, sending ceramic shards skittering across the floor in a dozen directions, and every single person in that space turned to watch. Katie registered the silence, the distinct absence of sound that meant everyone was holding their breath, and she registered the sound of Hargrove's chair scraping backward as he leaned back, his arms crossed over his chest like he'd just orchestrated a symphony. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice casual and loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Assuming you last the week." The residents laughed. One checked his watch as if timing her humiliation like a science experiment. Another pulled out his phone, and Katie understood in that moment that this was being documented, being shared, being turned into a story they'd tell for years. The new nurse. The one who couldn't even carry a lunch tray. Katie took one measured breath through her nose. She didn't feel rage. That was the thing no one ever understood about combat training. They thought it made you angry, made you explosive. It did the opposite. It distilled you down to pure function. Rage was inefficient. Rage made you sloppy. Instead, she felt the cold settling in her chest, felt her hands steady themselves, felt something shift in her that hadn't shifted since the day she'd left Helmand Province. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. She let it fall. She didn't wipe it immediately. She wanted him to see it, wanted him to think he'd won, wanted him to believe he'd broken something. Then she crouched slowly, gathering the scattered food, her movements deliberate and controlled. She picked up each piece of the broken mug, careful not to cut her hands. She wiped the soup with paper towels. She collected the salad leaves one by one, not rushing, not panicking, just working with the kind of methodical precision that came from 18 months of field surgery in a war zone where there was no such thing as a mistake. When she rose, her hands were steady. She turned to face Hargrove directly, and when their eyes met, she allowed the faintest smile to cross her face. It wasn't a smile of defeat. It was the smile of someone who'd seen actual darkness and found that cafeteria theater was just noise. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor," she said quietly. Her voice was steady as surgical steel. She wiped the single tear from her cheek without breaking eye contact, and for just a moment, something flickered across Hargrove's face. Not quite fear, but something close to it. She turned and walked to the trash bin, disposed of the waste, cleaned the floor, and returned to the surgical wing. Behind her, the cafeteria slowly resumed its murmur of conversation. The betting pool continued. But something had shifted in the room's chemistry, and Katie could feel it the way a predator feels the change in air pressure before a storm. That afternoon, Marcus Webb was prepped for emergency appendectomy. 7 doctors had already refused him. 7 different hospitals, 7 different explanations, all variations on the same word, complicated. His pre-existing conditions, the amputation stumps, the residual nerve damage, the morphine tolerance from years of chronic pain, made him too risky, too complex, too much of a liability. The hospital's legal team had finally called Hargrove directly that morning, explained that if they denied a man access to emergency surgery, they'd be opening themselves to a lawsuit that would make the pharmaceutical kickbacks look like a rounding error. Hargrove had agreed to the surgery the way a man agrees to remove a splinter, reluctantly and with visible irritation. Katie was assigned as his surgical nurse. She stood at the instrument table in pre-op, arranging the tools with unusual precision. Instead of the standard layout, she positioned them at angles that would minimize Marcus's movement during recovery, 40-degree approach for suturing, minimized shoulder engagement, everything designed for a body that couldn't rotate normally, couldn't compensate, couldn't shift its weight. The scrub tech noticed and said nothing. People in hospitals learned quickly not to question competence, and Katie's hands moved with a kind of practiced efficiency that suggested experience that went far deeper than her 3 years on record at Oak Creek. During the procedure, Hargrove worked with visible impatience, complaining in low mutters about the waste of resources and another complicated case, and Katie heard him but didn't respond. She anticipated every instrument before he asked for it. She positioned retractors with minimal force. She managed bleeding with an efficiency that made the surgical resident watching from the corner take mental notes. When it came time to close, she approached the tissue from a distinctive angle, a 40-degree insertion point that wasn't taught in most surgical programs because most surgeries didn't need it, but field medicine did, and Helmand Province had written the book on field medicine. The incision closed like a surgeon's signature. Hargrove didn't comment on the technique, which meant he'd noticed it. Marcus Webb was under general anesthesia, supposed to be completely sedated, his breathing controlled by the ventilator hissing its mechanical rhythm at the head of the table. But morphine had a way of creating moments of partial consciousness in patients with high tolerance, those strange dream states where the mind flickered like a failing light. His eyes fluttered open for just a moment, pupils large from the narcotics, vision probably blurred, but present. He stared directly at Katie's hands as she worked the suture pattern, and something in his expression changed. Not pain. Recognition. His voice came as barely a whisper through the breathing tube. "That's a Cobble running stitch, only combat medics know that angle." Katie's hands froze for half a second. That was it. That was the only telltale moment she allowed herself. The anesthesiologist immediately increased the sedation, confused by the patient's partial consciousness, by how a sedated man could have enough clarity to speak. The monitor adjusted. Marcus's eyes closed again. And Katie resumed suturing with the same methodical precision, her jaw tight now, the muscle moving barely perceptibly beneath her skin. After the surgery concluded, she checked Marcus's recovery vitals 3 times in the first hour. Hargrove had left, too many other surgeries, too many residents demanding his attention. The post-op recovery room was mostly quiet, just the machines and the breathing, and Katie stood at the edge of Marcus's bed and allowed herself to look at him. Really look at him. At the triple amputation, at the scars from IED shrapnel that had painted his arms in pale lines. At the face of a man who'd already been refused by 7 different doctors. She reached out and touched the edge of his bed rail, just barely, just for a moment. It looked like a gesture of reassurance, the kind of thing any good nurse would do for a patient in recovery. But it was something else. It was recognition. It was the silent communication of 2 people who'd both survived things they weren't supposed to survive. What happened next would change everything, but Katie didn't know that yet. She just knew that Marcus Webb had seen through her mask for a single, morphine-hazed moment. He'd recognized the Cubble running stitch not because he'd studied it in a textbook, but because he'd felt it being done to him in a forward operating base somewhere near Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 18 months ago, performed by a trauma surgeon whose name had been erased from every official database the moment she'd boarded the helicopter out. The appendectomy had never been guaranteed. That was the first thing Katie understood when she saw Marcus Webb wheeled into pre-op at 14:48 on a Tuesday. 7 different surgeons had already said no. 7. The number hung in the air like a diagnosis. Perforated bowel. Septic shock risk climbing by the hour. And every attending physician who reviewed his chart had looked at his prosthetics, seen the complexity, and walked away. Until hospital legal had intervened 40 minutes ago, cornering Dr. Hargrove with liability language and case precedent, forcing his hand. Now Marcus was here, and Hargrove was scrubbing in not because he wanted to save a life, but because refusing had become a legal liability he couldn't afford. Katie watched from the corner of the OR as the surgical team prepped him. She'd been assigned recovery room coverage, the least visible position, the job that kept her out of Hargrove's direct line of sight. That was fine. Invisible was how she'd survived this long. Marcus was already under anesthesia, his breathing controlled by the ventilator's steady mechanical rhythm, each breath a wheeze of oxygen and silence. His body looked smaller under the surgical drapes. Fragile in a way that made Katie's jaw clench. She'd seen soldiers with less damage walk away from firefights. She'd seen men with his injuries refuse to stop fighting. But she'd also seen what happened when the system decided you weren't worth saving. Hargrove moved through the incision with the precision of a surgeon who was genuinely skilled at his craft. That was always the most dangerous kind of antagonist, the one whose competence couldn't be questioned, only his ethics. His hands moved like a conductor's, commanding the residents around him. Retract. Suction. There, see the inflammation? That's been spreading for at least 6 hours. If we'd waited another 2, septic cascade. He said it like he'd wanted to operate all along, like legal hadn't forced his hand. Like he was the hero of this story. Katie had heard that tone before, in officers who took credit for their soldiers' work, in commanders who reframed cowardice as strategy. The tone of a man who believed his own mythology. The procedure took 93 minutes. Katie tracked the time on the wall clock, counting the minutes the way she used to count down radio checks in Sanjin Valley, each increment a small victory against catastrophe. When they wheeled Marcus into recovery at 16:20, his vitals were stable. Oxygen saturation 94%. Heart rate steady at 78. Blood pressure holding at 112/68. Stable was good. Stable was the baseline from which people survived. She'd been charting in the recovery ward for exactly 47 minutes when the alarm screamed. The oxygen saturation monitor's high-pitched wail cut through the recovery room's ambient drone like a blade through gauze. Katie's head snapped toward Marcus's bed before her conscious mind registered the sound. 89%. Dropping. The number cascading downward in real time, 87. 84, 82. The color was already leaving his lips, a faint purple creeping in at the edges like watercolor bleeding into white paper. She moved before thinking, the way bodies move when they've done something 1,000 times under fire. Her hands registered the physical signs even as her eyes confirmed them. Trachea deviated left, jugular veins distended like thick cords, breath sounds absent on the left side. Tension pneumothorax. The left lung had collapsed, and the air filling his chest cavity was compressing his mediastinum, pushing his heart aside, crushing everything. Code button already pressed. Crash cart already moving toward his bed. 30 seconds. That was the window. Maybe less. Get me a 14-gauge needle. Midclavicular line, second intercostal space. Her voice came out level, automatic, the voice of someone trained to function when the room was burning around her. One of the residents moved toward the supplies. Good. The room was responding to authority, even if it wasn't Hargrove's authority yet. And then Hargrove was there. He burst through the recovery room doors with the velocity of someone moving fast enough to convince himself he was in control. His eyes swept the monitors, took in the dropping saturation, the deviated trachea visible now on the portable ultrasound someone had already wheeled over. His face darkened, the kind of red that came from adrenaline and indignation mixing together in equal measure. Step back, Rodriguez. Not a request. His voice was the voice of institutional power, the voice of someone used to obedience. We wait for thoracic. Page Dr. Chen. Stat chest X-ray to confirm the diagnosis before we. Doctor, he has 5 minutes before cardiac arrest. Katie's hands were already counting ribs, her fingers finding the anatomical landmarks with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in sandstorms under gunfire. 2 ribs. Third intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The spot where the needle would release the pressure, where the hiss of escaping air would mean the difference between this man waking up and this man dying on a recovery room bed because protocol had mattered more than time. Hargrove stepped toward her, his body physically blocking her access to the crash cart. I said step back. That's an order. His jaw was tight. His eyes were the cold kind of angry, the kind that came from being questioned in front of residents. The kind that never forgot a slight. Oxygen saturation, 79%. Katie looked at Hargrove. Then at Marcus. Then at her hands. She stepped sideways, a lateral movement smooth as water, and kept walking toward the crash cart. Not challenging him. Not defying him overtly. Just moving with the absolute certainty of someone who understood that there were moments in medicine when permission was a luxury the body couldn't afford. She grabbed the 14-gauge needle from the supply tray, the plastic case snapping open with a small, decisive click, and counted Marcus's ribs with her left hand while her right hand positioned the needle at the exact angle, the exact depth, the exact intercostal space where a combat medic in Helmand Province had learned that the distinction between a live patient and a dead one was often measured in millimeters. You're performing a procedure without physician authorization. Hargrove's voice was ice now. Pure ice. That's grounds for immediate termination. The needle went in between the second and third ribs. The hiss of escaping air filled the room like a held breath being released. Oxygen saturation, 81%. 85%. 88%. 91%. Climbing toward normal. Marcus gasped, his entire body convulsing as his lungs suddenly had room to expand again. The blue was leaving his lips. His heart monitor shifted from the panicked rhythm of a desperate muscle back toward something resembling steady. The residents watched in absolute stillness, the kind of stillness that only happened when someone had just violated every rule and saved a life in the exact same motion. Your shift ends in 45 minutes, Hargrove said quietly. His voice had that terrifying quality of controlled fury, the tone of a man who'd just been humiliated in front of people he'd been training. Security will escort you out. You're done here. Katie set down the needle with the same precision she'd placed it. Her hands were completely steady. Adrenaline was still flooding her system, but her hands had learned to lie about that years ago. Yes, doctor. 8 words. Professional. Deferential. Exactly what he needed to hear to maintain his sense that he'd retained authority even though everyone in the room knew otherwise. She walked to the nurse's station without looking back. Her limp was more pronounced now, the adrenaline wearing off like a mask coming loose, old injuries flaring up, the shrapnel in her left thigh sending small electric signals with each weight-bearing step. She'd been hit by IED fragmentation 14 months ago on a patrol that officially never happened. The scarring was still tight. The pain was information. Pain was data. Pain meant she was still functional enough to do the work that mattered. Marcus Webb would wake up tomorrow. His lungs would work. His heart would beat. And Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez, the woman the Pentagon had erased and the Army had buried, the woman who'd been invisible at Oak Creek Memorial for exactly 8 days, had just made her first visible mistake. She pulled up the charting system and began documenting every moment of the crisis in clinical language, in medical precision, in the vocabulary that would protect her because documentation was armor and the truth, when recorded, was harder to dispute than a story told after the fact. Needle decompression performed at 16:08. Oxygen saturation pre-procedure, 79%. Post-procedure, 91%. Patient responsive. Vital stabilizing. By the time Hargrove walked past the nurse's station 20 minutes later, his face had settled back into its normal color. He'd already called legal. She could see it in the way his fingers were rigid, his jaw set like he was making calculations. A disabled Army Ranger with 7 surgical rejections now had a very clear story about who'd saved him, and that story involved a nurse who'd directly disobeyed a surgeon's explicit order. That story had witnesses. That story had a monitor strip showing the exact moment the oxygen saturation recovered. That story was a liability. But that wasn't the worst part. The door to Hargrove's office was slightly ajar. Katie could see the glow of his computer screen from the hallway, could hear the soft click of his mouse, the quiet rhythm of a man reviewing his own handiwork. She'd been walking past when she saw it, the billing spreadsheet open on his monitor, visible through the gap in the door frame. Routine appendectomies coded as emergency exploratory surgeries. Standard consultations listed 3 times over. Phantom lab work dated for procedures that hadn't happened yet. The pattern was unmistakable to someone who'd spent 16 months managing field triage under fire, someone who understood how to read logistics the way other people read novels. She pushed the door open. Hargrove didn't look up from his screen. Working late. Her voice was steady, conversational. The kind of tone that didn't announce anything. He glanced back at her reflection in the monitor, then swiveled his chair. Nurses don't concern themselves with administrative work, Rodriguez. His smile was the kind you'd see on a predator that didn't yet know it was surrounded. You have a shift ending in 20 minutes. I suggest you use it. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The office smelled like expensive cologne and the faint copper tang of the hand sanitizer he compulsively used after rounds. She'd noticed that weeks ago, the way he'd scrub his hands after touching patients, as if their suffering contaminated him. She moved closer to the desk. On the monitor, she could see 3 spreadsheet tabs open. The current one showed what looked like insurance billing codes. The second tab was labeled farm reps, the third was simply kickback schedule. Katie didn't reach for her phone immediately. She waited until he turned back to his work, until his attention drifted down to a stack of manila folders on his desk. Then she pulled out her phone, set it to camera mode, and photographed the first screen. The billing codes. The inflated amounts. The dates that didn't align with actual patient admissions. What are you doing? She'd been fast, but not fast enough. Hargrove was standing now, his chair rolling backward with a metallic squeal. His eyes moved from her face to her phone, and something in him shifted. Not fear, not yet, something more dangerous. Calculation. A man recognizing that a variable he'd accounted for had just become unpredictable. Katie pocketed her phone slowly. Making sure someone remembers. Get out of my office. She turned toward the door. Behind her, she heard him pick up his desk phone before she'd even closed it behind her. She was halfway down the corridor when his voice became audible through the closed door, not the words themselves, but the tone. The tone of a man calling in favors. The tone of someone who understood that problems needed to be solved before they metastasized. The tone of stage for escalation. 90 minutes. That's how long it took Hargrove to dismantle the carefully constructed fiction of Katie Rodriguez's civilian identity. 90 minutes from the moment she'd photographed his billing records to the moment security arrived at her locker with orders to escort her from the building. First, he called the 3 board members he'd been feeding kickbacks to for years. Men with real estate portfolios and vacation homes paid for by pharmaceutical companies. He told them Katie had performed an unauthorized procedure on a post-operative patient without physician supervision, that her credentials were questionable, that she'd accessed the medication override system without authorization. He framed it as professional liability. He made it sound like he was protecting them. They believed him. Of course they did. He was their partner. Then he contacted her references in Tampa. The address listed on her employment application. The nursing program she claimed to have graduated from 18 months ago. All of it was part of her Navy cover story, every piece of documentation impeccable, but when a hospital administration calls with threats of credential fraud and suggests that falsified employment records are federal crimes, even good actors don't hold together. The voicemails went unanswered. The references couldn't be verified. On paper, it looked exactly like what Hargrove was claiming, a nurse with fabricated credentials. By 5:33 p.m., he'd briefed 2 hospital investigators on the suspected drug diversion. He showed them her access logs to the pharmacy system, access granted because she was a surgical nurse who needed to pull medications during emergencies. He showed them Marcus Webb's post-operative pain management records and suggested discrepancies in the count. He didn't have evidence, not yet, but he had narrative. Narrative was often enough. By 6:15 p.m., security was waiting at her locker. The walk through Oak Creek Memorial's main corridor was the kind of silence that has weight. Katie carried a cardboard box, the kind used for patient discharge paperwork, pressed into her hands by a sympathetic intake clerk who'd seen enough institutional cruelty to recognize another victim. Inside it were the things she'd kept at her locker. A cracked Navy coffee mug, faded blue with a submarine etched in white. A dying succulent in a plastic pot, brown leaves curling downward like hands giving up. A photograph in a plastic frame, the image showing a lean man with sergeant's insignia, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into desert sunlight. Her gunner's mate. Petty Officer First Class Robert Chen. Dead for 3 years now, casualty of an operation that officially never happened. And at the bottom, wrapped carefully in old blue scrubs, the pair of worn combat boots from Helmand Province. 2 security guards flanked her, not roughly, just present. Their badges were polished. Their expressions were neutral. The evening shift was arriving as she walked past the main nursing station, the nurses she'd worked alongside for a week, the ones who'd asked her about her hometown, who'd laughed at her dry observations about hospital coffee. They turned away, their eyes finding sudden interest in their charts, their phones, the spaces between ceiling tiles. The residents from the betting pool, the ones who'd wagered on when she'd quit, watched in silence, their calculations suddenly rendered pointless. The doors opened onto the parking lot. Rain hammered the asphalt like applause for something nobody wanted to celebrate. Her shift hadn't ended. She hadn't clocked out. The hospital had simply decided she was no longer employed between one moment and the next, the way institutions do when liability becomes cheaper than loyalty. The bus stop on Wilmington Street was a metal shelter with half its plastic panels cracked. Katie sat on the bench and set the cardboard box beside her. The rain soaked through the bottom almost immediately, turning the paper soft and grainy. She opened it carefully, peeling back the wet layers until she reached the blue scrubs. Inside them, like archaeological evidence of someone else's life, were the boots. They were broken in the way only years of fieldwork could break leather. The soles were worn thin at the heels. The laces were frayed. They smelled like dust and oil and something else, something that belonged to a place that no longer officially existed. The left boot still had a faint bloodstain near the ankle, rust-colored, invisible unless you knew to look for it. Blood from the extraction in Sanjin Valley, August 2019. The night Operation Sandpiper went wrong and the army decided that Catherine Rodriguez had never existed in the first place. She turned the right boot over. The name tag was stitched to the interior, barely legible now, the letters faded from sweat and time and deliberate erasure. Senior Chief Petty Officer K. Rodriguez, Naval Special Warfare. That's all that remained. Not a photograph in any official database. Not a medical record that could be cross-referenced. Not a discharge summary or a security clearance form or a single file in the Pentagon's digital archives. Just this. Worn leather and a name so faded it looked like it had been written in disappearing ink. Headlights blurred past on Wilmington Street, their light reflecting off the wet pavement. Katie sat in the metal shelter with the dying succulent in her lap and the photograph of Robert Chen against her chest and the combat boots cradled like something that couldn't be allowed to break any further. The rain hammered harder. The box disintegrated. And somewhere in the city, in an office on the 4th floor of Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Hargrove was already calling his next contact, already beginning to reframe the narrative, already confident that an erasure that had worked once would work again. He didn't know who was about to walk through the hospital's doors the next morning. He didn't know that Marcus Webb's daughter Emily was a Navy nurse at Walter Reed. He didn't know that she'd spent the night making phone calls to people who owed her favors, to people whose entire purpose was to rescue warriors the government had tried to bury. He didn't know that a SEAL team leader was already in flight from Dam Neck, dress whites hanging in a garment bag beside him, his medals polished to a shine so bright it looked like liquid silver. He didn't know that an FBI agent had been investigating Oak Creek Memorial's billing fraud for 8 months and was simply waiting for probable cause. He didn't know that when you tried to erase someone, sometimes they came back with documentation. The next morning, Marcus Webb's daughter walked into the hospital board meeting like someone stepping onto a battlefield she'd spent her whole life training for, though nobody in that conference room would have understood it that way. Emily Webb was a paralegal, 28 years old, with her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, the kind of eyes that didn't look away. Dr. Hargrove was mid-sentence, his hands moving in that practiced way that made lying look like surgery, when Emily closed the door behind her and the sound echoed off the glass walls like a gavel strike. That woman, Emily said, her voice carrying the kind of precision that made the board chair set down his pen, is Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez, Naval Special Warfare. The room didn't just go quiet. It inverted into something else entirely. Hargrove's face cycled through colors, red to white to something that looked like ash. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The board chair's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. 7 doctors, Emily continued, moving toward the table with the calm of someone who'd learned composure from a man who'd learned it in places that didn't exist on maps. That's how many told my father he was too complicated. Too expensive. Pre-existing conditions. Unstable. That's the word they kept using, unstable. Like he was a problem to solve rather than a human being to treat. You know how many actually operated on him without complaint? She looked directly at Hargrove. 1. A woman in navy dress white stood then, rising from a chair that had been occupied the entire time, though nobody seemed to remember her arriving. She was tall, shoulders back like a rifle barrel, and her name tag read LTJG Sarah Chen, Naval Nurse Corps. She held a folder bound with a red security stripe, the kind that made federal agents and hospital lawyers sit forward at the same moment, as if pulled by the same wire. 16 field surgeries, Chen said, her voice like an instrument being tuned, precise and unavoidable. 0 mortality rate. 16 operations under fire in Helmand Province, Sanjin Valley specifically, conducted with equipment that would have made a veterinarian weep. 17 lives saved across 3 separate combat rotations. This is a declassified fragment, board members. The rest remains classified, but what's here is enough. She opened the folder and slid it across the glass table. The papers moved like they were carrying weight. Senior Chief Rodriguez doesn't just know how to operate. She's the kind of medic that other medics call when there's no other option. Hargrove stood. This is theater. This is. It's documentation, Chen interrupted. And it's about to get more specific. The door opened a second time, and the man who walked through was tall enough that his head nearly touched the doorframe, his dress white so immaculate they looked like they'd been carved from bone. His chest was a map of medals, ribbon upon ribbon stacked like sediment layers, and his presence made the air pressure change, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could devise. Senior Chief Petty Officer James Halloway, Team 3 Charlie Platoon, moved to the head of the table like he owned the room's oxygen supply. Senior Chief Rodriguez saved the life of Marcus Webb, Halloway said, and his voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage. She did it twice. Once on the surgical table, once with a needle decompression that your Dr. Hargrove explicitly refused to authorize. He placed 2 boxes on the table. The Navy recognizes service to the nation in multiple forms. He opened the first box. The medal sat on white silk, its ribbon a deep blue with white edges, the star catching the fluorescent light and throwing it back like a signal flare. Silver Star. For extraordinary heroism in combat, Halloway announced, and the board chair actually gasped. Operation Sandpiper, Helmand Province, 2015. Hargrove's hands had begun to shake. The second box opened to reveal a bronze star. Then another. 2 bronze stars with valor, their ribbons a pattern of red and white that looked like a heartbeat made visible. There are 2 more decorations in her official file, Halloway continued, his eyes never leaving Hargrove's face. But we're keeping those classified. This is what the public record can know. This is what your hospital now knows. You have a senior chief petty officer on your nursing staff. She saved your patient when 7 other doctors refused. And you fired her for it. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the door opened again. An FBI agent walked in like the morning was simply following her schedule. Special Agent Lisa Morrison, her credentials folder open like she'd been reading it on the way in, moved past Halloway with a nod of mutual respect. She laid documents across the conference table in the practice motion of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, inflated billing codes bleeding across spreadsheets, phantom consultations, pharmaceutical kickback payments traced through shell accounts straight to an offshore number that resolved to Dr. Hargrove's personal accounts. 8 months, Agent Morrison said. We've been investigating Oak Creek Memorial's billing irregularities for 8 months. Insurance fraud. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. You 3 board members, she pointed at 3 separate faces around the table, have been receiving payments from these accounts since 2019. Congratulations. You're all going to need attorneys. She turned to Hargrove. And you, Doctor, committed a federal offense when you attempted to forge personnel records to discredit a witness. That triggered alarms in the Navy database, the FBI database, and the Department of Defense database simultaneously. So we have you on 16 counts of healthcare fraud and 1 count of falsifying federal records in an attempt to obstruct justice. The rubber gloves Hargrove had been holding fell to the floor, and the sound they made hitting the tile was somehow louder than any of the words that had preceded it. You're under arrest, Morrison said. She was already reaching for the handcuffs. Security arrived, not the hospital kind, the federal kind, with badges and the particular competence of people who'd done this before. They read Hargrove his rights in the hallway he'd ruled for a decade, their voices precise and impersonal, the words falling like rain on concrete. Nurses watched. Residents watched. The attending physician from the morning shift watched. Hargrove's face had gone somewhere far away, disconnected from his body, as they applied the flex cuffs and began walking him toward the elevator. The hallway outside the recovery ward was where Marcus Webb was waiting. He stood on his prosthetics, the carbon fiber ones that gave him back 3 inches of height, powered by muscles that remembered what moving used to feel like, supported by Emily Webb's arm but not leaning on it. Just there. Present. Vertical. His daughter had positioned him in that hallway deliberately, and when Dr. Hargrove was led past, still protesting, still arguing, still not understanding that the ground beneath him had collapsed, Marcus Webb brought his hand up in a slow, deliberate motion. His palm moved from his side to his chest, the gesture of a military salute delivered with a kind of precision that only comes from a body trained by combat. The salute hung in the air like an accusation. In the visitors' area beyond the recovery ward's glass partition, Katie Rodriguez watched the entire sequence unfold with the composure of someone who'd already survived the worst this hospital could devise. She was wearing jeans for the first time anyone at Oak Creek Memorial had seen, dark blue and fitted, and a navy t-shirt with the faded emblem of her unit barely visible after years of washing. Her hair was down, past her shoulders, no longer pulled back in the severe bun she'd worn for 3 months. She looked like someone who'd finally set down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten its shape. When Marcus offered that salute, Katie Rodriguez brought her hand up in response, the movement sharp and clean, a mirror image, the gesture of someone who'd done it 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. Her eyes met his across the distance. No words were necessary. The salute contained them all. The hospital's legal team was already drafting reinstatement papers in the administrative office, documents that bore the weight of federal investigation and would carry her back into the institution that had tried to erase her. The medical board was already moving to review Hargrove's license for permanent revocation. In the parking lot, federal agents were loading boxes of evidence into unmarked vans while local news crews set up cameras, sensing that this story had the particular smell of institutional failure that made for compelling television. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez stood in her new office at Oak Creek Memorial, the small brass plaque on her door reading Director, Veteran Surgical Unit. The walls around her were pale gray, functional, but on the far wall sat a shadow box constructed from dark walnut, and inside it rested her pair of worn combat boots, the ones from the cardboard box in the rain, the ones that had been the only proof she'd ever served. Beside them lay her silver star, its ribbon a blue so deep it looked like it contained its own gravity. The 2 bronze stars with Vela sat in their own frame below, and a photograph completed the arrangement, a team photo from Helmand Province, 16 years younger, faces painted with desert dust and something that looked like purpose. Marcus Webb walked the unit's halls 3 days a week on his prosthetics, volunteering to visit veteran patients who arrived with their own trauma histories, their own invisible wounds. He would sit beside their beds and tell them about the nurse who saved him twice. About the surgeon who didn't wait for permission. About the moment a salute became the most powerful thing that could happen in a hallway. Dr. Hargrove's medical license was permanently revoked by the state board following his federal conviction. 16 counts of healthcare fraud. 1 count of falsifying federal records. His name appeared in hospital training modules as a cautionary example of institutional corruption. But the photograph that arrived at Katie's office, anonymous and unmarked, showed him in a gymnasium at Coastal Community College, standing before a whiteboard with CPR diagrams sketched on it in blue dry erase marker, teaching bored teenagers the mechanics of chest compressions for $16 an hour. His expression in the photograph was hollow, the kind of hollow that comes from a man who'd had everything taken away and deserved far worse. The betting pool whiteboard, the one from the residence lounge where they'd wagered money on Katie's quit date, had been removed and hung on the wall of her new office. Someone had crossed out all the dates in black marker. Underneath, in red letters, someone else had written a single word, never. Emily Webb had transferred to Oak Creek Surgical Department 3 months ago. She worked alongside Katie Rodriguez 2 days a week, learning the kind of medicine that existed in the space between protocols and intuition, where a nurse who'd survived combat could read a patient's body like a map of where it was breaking down. On Katie's desk sat the succulent, thriving now under proper light and regular water, its leaves a deep green that seemed to contain its own energy. Beside it was the navy mug with a crack that had been repaired in the Japanese tradition, filled with gold leaf, the break transformed into beauty, the fracture made precious. She still walked with that slight limp on humid mornings. She still took one measured breath before responding to challenges. But she no longer hid. The transformation was complete, the timid nurse had been replaced by the senior chief, and everyone at Oak Creek Memorial had learned the cost of confusing quiet with weakness. The final image that captured Katie Rodriguez was in the early morning, before the surgical unit filled with patients, moving through the veterans' ward in her scrubs, and the men and women in those beds, the amputees, the traumatized, the ones who carried invisible shrapnel, looked up at her passing and nodded. Some in recognition. Some in respect. Some in the simple acknowledgement that they were in the presence of someone who understood. A handwritten note was pinned to her office door, added by an unknown hand, the words in pen that looked like it had been moving through water. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If you've made it this far in this story, you already know the truth. The quietest person in the room might be the one holding everything together. If Katie's story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had to hide who you are to survive, please subscribe, hit that like button, and comment what you would have done differently. What would you risk to save someone the world had already given up on?